So what I thought it would be great for you all to hear about what was working and not working in the different jurisdictions across the country. So start with Mark about talking about what do you think is working well in Tasmania about violence against children, where do you think we need to improve?
Sure, I was hoping to get the last seat here, but I'm in the first. One thing that I've heard this morning, which kind of relates to what's happening in Tasmania, is violence against children is often very difficult to quantify and recognise, and it's nearly an occult problem in society. What's happening in Tasmania? There's been some great progress on women, adults in family violence. Tracy, I was heartened to hear your very frank conversation this morning around your take on it, and you mentioned that children are not the pull-along luggage to the issue. And I guess one thing that has been happening in Tasmania is I've spent the last few years trying to share that message and actually bring to light that children are exposed to a whole range of, I guess, manifestations of violence. We have a very supportive state government in regard to addressing this, but I think the challenge that many of us face is actually being able to recognise it and bring it to light, and then bring to bear the very complex range of solutions. One thing I've heard from this fabulous conference this morning is we don't do it alone. You know, the international collaboration we heard about this morning, I think coming to today's event helps actually tie it together. And our job is to even more robustly try to bring together what's happening in our various roles across the states, but with our various allies. I'll just close off with this comment. One of the most powerful ways of bringing this really, really critically important issue to the fore is actually, in a safe and careful way, is actually seek out what young people have got to say about this and get them in front of the decision makers. That will shift conversations, it'll shift focus, it'll brighten the spotlight in a way that myself and others could never do. So just my brief roundup. What's happening in Tasmania? We're trying to get children, we're trying to get a spotlight on their needs in regard to violence. They're not just an accessory to the adult world. That's all.
In the Northern Territory, we're reaching the end of a Royal Commission into youth detention and child abuse. The Don Dale incidents, conditions, which led to the Four Corners program, which led to the Royal Commission, has been well publicised, not only here in Australia but across the world. And I was recently in America and I was talking to someone. I said, I'm from the Northern Territory in Australia. And they said, oh, you're the people that had that really bad thing happen in youth detention. And that was in North America. So it has reached parts of the world that you wouldn't think. In terms of the Territory, we are in a real transitional stage with everyone saying, oh, let's wait and see what the Royal Commission is going to recommend. It's coincided with a new government that has taken the plight of vulnerable children very seriously and done a number of things in terms of the structure of government. I'm apparently getting a lot more resources, which I'm really happy about. The oversight of services to kids will be something that will be emphasised. But with the Royal Commission, and if you ever took the time to listen to the questions that Margaret White and Mick Gooder asked, it gave me a sense of optimism that they actually understand that we've got to stop looking at the symptoms and actually go to the real crux of the problem, and that is, you know, poverty and violence, particularly violence against kids, undiagnosed mental health, you know, overcrowding, all of those issues that exist, but more so in the Northern Territory where we have a high number of Indigenous, very vulnerable Indigenous people. About 32% of our population is Indigenous, and of that 32%, 75% of them live in what I would term remote areas, and in a lot of those remote communities in the Northern Territory, they live in very much third world country conditions, not like the rest of Australia. And so then when we're talking about services and changing people's minds and being able to educate and support. It's so difficult and it's so challenging when we can't even get the basic services to some of the communities. And it will be interesting to see if the Royal Commission have found a way forward, but it is going to take a significant amount of money and goodwill and a change of hearts and minds about what's possible, and certainly a sense of optimism. If you look at Aboriginal women in the Northern Territory, they're 30 times more likely to be assaulted than a non-Aboriginal woman. And if you think about it in terms of their children, and I like your term too about the excess baggage, then you have to say that translates directly to the plight of those children. One of the areas in the Northern Territory I've been looking at is not only changing the community's views around young people. They're very much demonised up there. And the Dondale investigation and the following media also polarised the community about, particularly with Dylan Voller. People are angry that he's been given a voice of young people. And I can tell you that young person is one of the most remarkable people you'll ever meet in terms of his background and where he's come from. And the fact that he can stand up and articulate what's occurred to him and say, please don't let this happen to other young men or young people, is just completely remarkable. And it takes young people like Dylan Voller, I think, to get people to understand. And even though the explosion and the shock that Four Corners resulted in, it had to happen. And it really invoked an emotive response by people that I would never think would have any sort of sympathy for children. And our phones ran off the hook for days with people in tears and saying, how did this happen? How did we allow this to happen? So for the Northern Territory, we're not waiting and seeing. The government is on the front foot, but we do have some unique challenges, and it is going to take a whole of community way of thinking, and that sense of optimism is, and as Andrew's statistics showed today, that young people believe that we can change the outcomes, and I think young people really are the key to that, and their voices are the ones that we need to listen to and understand that that's the voice that should be the most loud, that's the loudest, and we should listen to. So I'm certainly optimistic about the future, and it's a kind of wait and see at the moment.
I've been in my role as Commissioner in Victoria for just over a year, and when I came into the role, I thought that I was taking it on at a really exciting time. And the reason I thought that was because I felt like we knew more about harms done to children, about violence to children, than we ever had before. We'd had the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse in Institutions running. Another inquiry on that same issue in Victoria had run previously. We've had the Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria. There was a focus and an understanding about family violence and to some degree the impact on children that we've never had before. So it felt like there was an incredible opportunity and a time that there was political will to act, a shift in community awareness, and all of those things I think are true. In terms of what that has resulted in, I won't go through all of the impacts, but there's no question, if you look at the trends of what is known, Mark is right, there's so much that we don't know about the extent to which children experience violence. But even those indicators that we do have they're all going up. So our notifications to Child Protection in Victoria over the past 4 years, they've gone up 45%, substantiations, so where there's the kind of meeting the threshold of harm, up by 50%, the number of children removed and put into out-of-home care, up by 50% as well, the number of criminal offences where children are the victims, up, the number of allegations of abuse in organisations trending up and up. So I'm not one to say those upward trends are bad, because like with violence against women, we have to improve awareness and improve reporting as we tackle with the scale of the problem. But at the same time, we've got to remember that there's a huge amount of violence against children that we don't see, that we don't have data for. So we don't have data for children's experience of bullying and harassment. We don't have good data on children with disabilities' experience of force and restraint. We don't have good data, certainly in Victoria, because I've looked at it hard, on the experience of children in youth detention, youth justice detention, and their experience of force and assault. We don't have data for a whole lot of information about what's going on for children and young people. And of course, what we don't see, really we don't care about, and we certainly don't have that impetus to act. So one of the things that I'm really excited about today is it joins the dots. It joins the dots and encourages us to see violence against children in all its forms and really nudges us along. Certainly you in New South Wales, because Andrew's talking to you directly, but it nudges those of us in other jurisdictions along to start conceptualising all of these different issues as violence against children and connecting them with the notion of children's rights, a concept that hasn't had a whole lot of truck in Australia, I have to say, and actually doing some real work on that. Andrew's question was what's working well and not so well in Victoria, and I might just very quickly talk about family violence as an example of an issue where there's incredible progress, and it also is an issue where we're seeing it can be really hard to get the focus on children that we need. And it is, again, picking up a little bit from what Tracy alluded to at the start. So in Victoria, and I've worked in and around family violence for a long time, we've had a pretty remarkable period. Starting when Luke Batty was killed by his father, and his mum, Rosie, moved almost immediately, remarkably, into such a strong advocacy role. We've seen the Royal Commission, we've seen government commitment to act on all of its 227 recommendations. We've seen incredible investment, $1.9 billion investment in family violence from this year's state budget alone. Now, the Royal Commission was very clear about, amongst all of the other issues it identified, it said children are often the silent, invisible victims of family violence. It said family violence services historically haven't been very good at recognising children as victims in their own right and responding to their needs. And children's services, and certainly child protection is one of those, haven't been good at recognising, responding to, and working appropriately with family violence when it's affecting the children that they see. And certainly all of that is very consistent with what we see at the Commission. We still see, through our child death inquiry work, situations where child protection massively underestimates, in fact, not just child protection, all of the services that have engaged with a child massively underestimates the impact that living in violence has on that child, with the consistent effect that children are left living with violence with no meaningful service intervention at all. We repeatedly see that women are held accountable to keep their kids safe by child protection, even though those women aren't given support to do so. So these themes we see very strongly, and we see them still. My experience as Commissioner for Children in this incredible reform environment in Victoria around family violence is that I still, at the different ministerial and other meetings where we're overseeing implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations, almost every meeting, either I or my colleague Andrew Jackamus, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, sometimes both, have to say, depending, whatever the context really, and children, and children, and children. And we've had to say that continuously for a year. It's had some positive effects, so this 10-year action plan has a good focus on children. There's some investment in training for child protection around family violence. There's some investment in more counselling for children affected by family violence. So there is some progress, but it's hard fought, very hard fought. And we still, even though this whole focus really began in Victoria with the death of a child that allowed decades of work by survivors and advocates to really trigger into what has been an environment where we think there's the possibility of once-in-a-generation reform. Even though that was kicked off by the death of a child, children are largely absent from both the political conversation and the community conversation. So for me, that's a bit symbolic of the work that we've all got to do together to escalate not only children's experience of family violence, but children's experience of violence across the board into a whole nother level.
So I wanted to make a couple of observations and then a couple of comments. In some of the data that Andrew showed to us earlier this morning, the AIHW data around the prevalence of emotional abuse and neglect and the visibility or invisibility of that. And we were asked by the experts before about the use of corporal punishment, which is one of the areas that was touched on earlier. And for me, thinking about the responsibility that we have in service systems and in delivering services overall to understand not only the observation that children have about their experience of violence, but our responsibility to understand the impact of that on a developing brain and the patterns that it forms and where that leads to in what we know about attachment and psychological health and physical health and well-being, but to really get in behind that and to try and capture our understanding of it a bit more. One of the things that I'm interested in is the importance of understanding children and orienting them in their community, in their family, place and culture, and understand the protective factors that go with that and some of the heritage that we have in this state around exactly that, and understanding that children are part of a place and friends and family and what that affords them to understand where they can seek their heroes, the people who they can go to when something's not quite right, but what that affords children as a protective factor. And I think that we've got some interesting reforms going on in New South Wales that seek to take us further in some ways around the role that health and education play, particularly for vulnerable children. But we have got a lot more to do in thinking about how we allow those more protective community level factors to really have an important part in understanding children, not as a risk of significant harm report or a client, but as a child in an environment, and to allow those protective factors to be enhanced rather than cut away. I'm struck, early days for me in the role in New South Wales, but I really am struck as in thinking about today, that it really should never be up to a child alone to speak up when something is wrong and they're not safe in whatever service system that might be or whatever place they live in. It shouldn't just be beholden to them to find someone to speak to. And so it really is important that as oversight bodies we take that role seriously in understanding the voice and the assertiveness we need to have in bringing forward where things really are pretty rubbish for kids. And what systems have to learn, and trying to continue to press forward for a better quality of care, particularly for the most vulnerable of our children and young people, but that we take seriously as people who are stewards of the systems that try to give children better lives, the way that we can hear their voice, bring it out more and understand what role it can play in helping us to improve what we do every day.
Did the panel want to talk about what do you think are the major hurdles? We've touched on some of them, but maybe expand on those and maybe talk about some of the other things that we've had in the collective conversation about where we need to get over to ensure that children are central and paramount to this discussion.
From a Northern Territory perspective, one area that we are really grappling with at the moment, and it's where I've put my focus, the Territory is has a relatively small population, and the general public have easy access to politicians, people who are in positions of power, decision-making power. And so therefore, if you have a major business who is a very much a corporate player in the Territory environment and they are the victim of a crime that's committed by a young person, all of a sudden there is a campaign again that's almost like they drag it out again, and it's a campaign against young people. Only as recently as last week, they called for a curfew on young people. I wouldn't have to preach to anyone in this room. I'm sure that the research says and has said for many years that curfews don't work and they are not the solution. But we are still dragging out those sort of potential strategies. So it kind of says to me that we've got a long way to go. The issue is understanding the cohort who are committing the crimes. And unless we go back and we demonstrate that these are young people who are from very disadvantaged backgrounds, mostly from disadvantaged backgrounds with high needs, and if I had half an hour to present to you the Dylan Voller story and where he came from and what he went through well before he entered any youth detention at the age of 11, there are many Dylan Vollers, and they are generally the ones that are causing the most destruction in the community. But it's until we address the needs of those individuals that we will not change either of those trends. As Liana says, everything's trending in the wrong direction. More kids in detention, more kids in the child protection system, kids staying in protection longer, and kids with a lot of the education statistics are really poor as well, more suspensions. If you looked at the education statistics in the Northern Territory, we're going in the wrong direction in terms of educational outcomes for kids. So none of the trends are going in the right direction. And then we have this element of our society that thinks that locking kids up is going to give the community some reprieve and is going to be a solution. So, the challenge for me is convincing the community that is not the way, and I guess them understanding that the cohort, the young people we're dealing with, need support and love and real wraparound services and intensive response based on their individual needs. And that is a massive challenge, but it's not insurmountable. And that's why the young people who are next door are so important in doing that.
One of the challenges, I think, is precisely as Colleen describes, communities' attitudes to children and young people. So we all can feel and we can imagine the tabloid outrage when we think of a small child who is subject to abuse or serious neglect. But when that child grows up and the impact of that trauma manifests in less palatable ways through substance abuse or problematic behaviour or offending, our outrage is turned on the child, who may or may not have made it to adolescence by that point in time. So in terms of actually getting a consistent condemnation of violence against children, regardless of what they've done, regardless of the setting, whether it's youth justice or another institution, we've got a lot of work to do to inform the broader community about the impact of negative childhood experiences, and also just get them on side with condemning that. I think the other broad problem that I see, I don't know if we've talked about this at our ACCG meetings in as many words, but I go back to the comment that I made before about I don't think in Victoria, in Australia or indeed in Victoria, we don't have, unlike across the international NGO community certainly, we don't have a good, strong concept that we've really owned of children's rights and children's rights not only to be protected but also to be seen as rights bearers who can have a say and participate. We are so far from making that real. So when it comes to the proposition before us today, which is let's look at children and all their experiences and all of the ways in which those rights are impacted, we don't have a good conceptual basis to really start grappling with that. And so I think that's one of the hurdles. I think yes, absolutely we need to, as we're doing today, look at violence against children and how we end that, but we have to, as a parallel piece, look at how we conceive of children and young people and really confront the fact that we've got a bit of work to do on that as well.
One thing I think that most of us in this particular space, the commissioners, we come across these young people who end up in the youth justice system, whatever that looks like. I would love to see the day come when we can actually ask, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you, what did you do? And that would shift the whole argument and goes back to early intervention and prevention. And we often start so far down the track once... I'm looking at Graham Vimpani, who's worked in this space most of his life, is actually early intervention, prevention. it works well, but it also isn't working well because there ain't enough of it.
Can I just add to just that comment that Mark's made, and I think it's about the language too, and it's like, what have we done to fail you? As opposed to, as Mark says, what have you done? You know, it's once a child enters youth justice, you know, it's a crisis point, and I always think of it as a point of failure. What have we done to fail that child?
To just quickly add, once these children are in the youth justice system, and I think it's pretty well right around the country, they are subject to lots of violence in its many forms. You know, these children have been subject to violence, and that's why they end up there. Then they come into the state care. It's not a popular topic to talk about, but they're actually further abused.
Given that you're all extraordinary advocates, you've got in the room members across the New South Wales government, you've got in the room the leaders of the NGO community. What would you say to the room of New South Wales leaders, what they can do, should be doing about the issue of violence against children?
For governments, I think that any major government policy needs to have a component of what impact that policy has on a child, for everything. We're campaigning in the Northern Territory at the moment with government to ensure that there's a cabinet subcommittee just on children, and every major government decision has to have what impact that has on children and families, with the child first.
Just picking up on your line, Andrew, probably a very good lens or to sharpen the focus is actually through a child rights framework. Yeah. And if that is your primary lens in how you actually undertake whatever you're doing, you can't really go far off the track. I find it a great guide to the job I do now, sometimes on an hourly basis. If you just look at what is the implications, does this fit with the child rights, I think you can't go far off track.
I agree with Mark and Colleen, which is always good. I think there's something very simple for me, which is about no matter what part of government you're in, what services you're designing or planning or indeed providing, no matter what field your NGO is in, there's something really simple for me about always remembering. It's like a mental version of the child impact statement that Colleen's talking about, always including an assessment in your thinking about, and what about the child here? Not just the child connected to the adults in their life, not just the child connected to the school or their peers, but what about the child? What are the issues? What are the implications? What are the impacts? What are the potential benefits for a child or children in whatever space? The other thing that I would say is, don't assume you know that, or you have access to the knowledge that will allow you to make that assessment well. And this isn't possible for every decision or every assessment or every piece of work you do, but find ways to understand what children and young people would say and think, and what their experiences they might have. And if you're not doing that, you're just assuming that adults know best, and that is the complete antithesis of a child rights approach.
I think the other part for me sort of goes to what I said earlier in terms of not. I think the drift in government is always to think about, and quite rightly, the children who are our most vulnerable, and you end up then thinking of children as users of a service system. Yeah. And for me, there is always a bravery in the public sector of pushing to say children are children, and you need a broader narrative about children and families that isn't just those who are broken, but those who just want an ordinary life, and how we orient that as in our health systems and our schools, and not just think about those who are most troubled. And I think that's the policy bravery. There's some politics in it as well, of course, but for me that's the bravery we have to have as public servants, to ask a different question about what we want to say about children, and not just that they are vulnerable and to be done to, but they're people who have a right to a different experience, whether they are vulnerable or not, in the services that they use.